Howdy guys, welcome back to BIG Photography. This is Ben, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about brush basics. This is a great video if you're new to Affinity Photo, and whether you're using it for photo editing or digital painting, I'm going to go over some of the basic settings that most of the brushes in Affinity Photo use so that you'll have a better understanding of what those settings do when you are creating. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so in this video, I'm mainly going to be talking about the brush settings that are up here at the top, and I'm going to be using the paintbrush tool as the main brush in all these examples, mainly because most of the other brushes all have the same settings. Some might have a few missing, or some might have one or two options that are specific to that brush, but for the most part, all of your brushes will have these basic settings that can be adjusted. Now, there is another way to change brush settings by using the Edit Brush menu. But I'm not going to be talking about it too much in this video just because there are a lot of settings that can be adjusted and the video would end up being way too long. So I'm just going to keep things pretty simple for this first video. So before we start painting, I'm going to need to create a new pixel layer that I can paint on. Currently, I have a blank transparent layer, as you can see by this checkerboard pattern. And when you create a new document, you have the option to have a white background or a transparent background like I have here. So I'm going to go over to down here and add a new pixel layer. And now if I have my paintbrush selected and I'm going to switch to the color black, I can start painting. Now I want to have a white background just so it's easier to see. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Layer, New Fill Layer, and that's going to give me a colored background. Now currently it's set it to white, but if you were to come up here to the Move tool, and with that new fill layer selected, you can then, let's go and make a color. You can change that color background to any color you want. I'm going to keep it as white for now. So I'm going to bring the saturation all the way down and the luminosity all the way up to make white. And then that new pixel layer, I'm going to put on top. So that way I am painting above this white background. If I turn that fill layer off, you'll still see I have my transparent background there. Okay, so right now I am in the basic brush menu here. If I click on this, you're going to see some of the other brushes that come with Affinity Photo. Now, some of these you will not have because these are brushes that I have purchased, but I think all the ones with this little chain link icon are the ones that come with Affinity Photo, but we're going to stick with the basics for now. And let me just go ahead and start by grabbing let's try this 32 round brush, click on that. And now when I come over here and start painting, let's make sure I have black as my paint color. You're going to see now I can paint. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what we can do and what we can change with this brush. Let me go ahead and undo this. Starting here at the left, we have width. That's pretty simple, right? We can adjust the width, which is the size of our brush, by using the slider. Now it's at 250 pixels. You can also double click in here and type an amount. So I can type in 100. And now I have a brush width of 100. You can also use keyboard shortcuts. I think by default, the keyboard shortcuts for increase and decrease brush size in Affinity Photo is the left and right bracket. So you can adjust your brush size like that. This is actually my preferred method. That way I can always use my left hand to adjust my brush size while I am working with my right hand. And another way you can change the brush size is, and forgive me as I don't know the keyboard commands on a PC, but on a Mac, you can hold down the Control and Option key and then click down on your mouse and drag left and right to increase or decrease the brush size. And if you go up and down, it will increase and decrease the hardness, which we will talk about in a second. Okay, let's look at our next setting. So we talked about hardness. So right now I'm going to have my hardness set to 100%. So that means that the edges of my brush are very sharp and very defined. You can see they are very sharp. Now, if I bring my hardness down all the way to 0%, you're going to notice the brush gets smaller, but the edges get very soft, right? If I go ahead and just click down once, you're going to see a very soft edge, where if I bring it to 100% and make it here, you're going to see that it is very hard edged. So when you are painting with a soft brush, you're going to get a lot softer edges here. Now, right now, because of this way this brush is set up, you see some weird spacing between this brush. I'm going to show you what this is for 1 second. Let me go ahead and undo this. Now, I'm not going to talk about this like I said, but if you go ahead to your brush and you can right click and see the Edit Brush menu, or you come over here and you click More, it will bring up the Brush Edit menu. And in this setting, you're going to see something called spacing. And if I drag the spacing far apart, you're going to see what this does. So basically a brush is just kind of like a stamp. Think of it as a single stamp that is kind of being repeated over and over again as you paint. So right now, if my spacing is set very far apart, I'm going to close this and I start painting, you're going to see that the spacing has now become very far. If I go back to that menu and bring my spacing all the way down to 0, you can see there is no spacing between my kind of individual stamps. And then when I paint, you have this really thick, solid line of paint. Let's go ahead and undo this. And let's go back one more time. And so when you want to get a really, really soft brush, you want to try to find a spacing that hides the gaps between those individual kind of stamps, but keeps it really soft. I found that usually around 15 to 14% will keep your brush really soft without having any visible spacing. So that's one option you can look at. And now let's look at the difference between opacity and flow, because opacity and flow kind of do the same thing. They just do them a little bit differently. And it's important to understand that difference so you can choose the one that works best for you or depending on what you want to do. So up here we have our opacity and flow percentages. We can of course change that by clicking here and moving this slider. You can click inside of here and type any number you want. But one of the convenient things with opacity and flow is you can just type in a number to change their value. So for example, if I press the number 3 on my keyboard, it will change the opacity down to 30%. 7 gives me 70%. If I type in 89, I'll get 89%. And 0 brings me back to 100. To change flow, you have to hold the Shift key and you can press 3 and that gives me 30%. If I press 56, I get 56. And if I hold down Shift and press 0, that brings me back to 100%. Okay, so for this example, I'm going to continue to use black as my color. I'm going to go ahead and just paint a black little area right here as kind of our reference. Now I'm going to go ahead and change my opacity down to, let's go ahead and do 20%. I'm going to press 2 on my keyboard. And now when I paint, you're going to see that I am now painting black, but at 20% opacity. Now the way opacity works is as long as I do not lift my mouse button or lift my pen from my tablet, I can continue to paint and the value will always stay at a consistent 20%. Now, once I lift my mouse and click down again, now that opacity is going to be built up on top of that previous area we painted on. And I continue to paint. It does not change until I lift my mouse and click down again to basically add another layer of opacity on top. And I can continue to do that if I want to slowly build up my opacity, where in this case it's going to get darker and darker, like so. So this is a very good way because you can easily control the amount of color you are putting down. If I wanted to make this lower edge darker, let's go ahead and make my brush a bit smaller. I can paint over this whole area and I can do it very controlled because I don't have to worry about any more paint coming out. It's only going to be painting at 20% opacity. Let go of the mouse once and let's paint a little bit of darker area. And you can see I can come right up to the edge here, do something like this. And I can continue to do this if I wanted to kind of make a, I don't know, some kind of shape. I could even switch my color to white to do a highlight on this side. So I can come over here and you're going to see that this is now going to get lighter, and then lift my mouse up, paint again, and I can kind of create this, I don't know, shaded looking thing. Now, right now I have my hardness set to 100% just so we can easily see what is happening, how each layer of opacity is being put on top of the previous one. But of course, if you were to change your hardness down to 0%, let's go ahead and make a brand new layer. I'm going to turn this one off for now. If I have my hardness set down to 0%, I'll be able to kind of create a bit smoother looking gradients just because that edge is quite soft, and that's going to allow me to kind of create a more softer looking gradient. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to here. So let's look at flow then. How does flow work? So let's go ahead and change our opacity over to 100%. And now let's change our hardness back to 100%. Now let's change our flow down. Now flow, the ink comes out a lot faster. So I'm gonna actually change my flow down to something like 3%. You're gonna see what I mean in a second. So the way flow works is as soon as you press down on your mouse and you start painting, ink is gonna start flowing out of the brush in a sense. Think of it kind of like an airbrush. The longer you hold down in one spot, that color is going to get darker and darker. So if I start painting here, you're going to see that as I continue to go over a particular spot, that area is going to get darker. Now I have not lifted my mouse up yet, or my pen. I'm just continuing to paint in one single stroke. If I wanted to kind of recreate something like that, I might actually kind of start dark and kind of like do something like, I don't know, just painting here. Again, I have not lifted my pen once. I'm just painting in one continuous stroke, and the ink is slowly flowing out at a percent of 3%. Now, of course, just like before, I'm going to go ahead and turn this layer off, make a brand new layer. If I reduce my hardness down to 0%, I'll be able to get a lot more smoother transitions between my opacities and kind of create a more natural looking shaded look. You can see something like that. Okay. Now, one thing that's very important, and actually let's make another layer again. One thing that's important to know that may not actually have any real impact on your work, but it is something to be aware of. Let's go ahead and change our flow back to 100% and our hardness back to 100%. Make this brush a bit smaller. If you paint with a opacity or flow of less than 50%, you will never be able to build up to 100% opacity. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and paint this black spot as our reference. Now I'm going to take this little sampler over here. I'm going to drag it over top of this black part, and it's going to tell me the readout of this color, which is telling me it's black. There is 0 information in red, green, and blue. Okay. So now let's go ahead and change our opacity down to 50%. And I'm going to paint right next to it. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to move this little second sampler over here, this white part. And you're going to see currently it's showing me white. 255, 255, 255. Now if I paint at 50% opacity, black, you're going to notice that that value halves, right? It goes down to 128, 128, 128. Now, if I paint over that area again, it halves again down to 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. And then no matter how much I paint, it will never actually reach full opacity. Basically, what it's doing is when I paint down this 50% here, when I paint another 50% on top of it, it's basically halving the distance from that previously put down color to 100% opacity, which means that if you are continually halving that distance, you will never mathematically reach 100% opacity. Flow is similar, although flow will get to 100% opacity at 50%, but if I were to do something like 43%, let's move this little sampler over here, and I start painting with flow, continuing to paint down, it will never reach full opacity. Now with flow, if I release the mouse once and start painting over it again, then I'm able to achieve 100% opacity. This is more apparent when you are actually flowing with something really low. For example, if I do 3% here, and let's move this target over here, and I start painting with a 3% flow, it does take a lot longer to get down. And you'll notice that after a while, it won't even get that close to 100% opacity because our flow already started off so low. If I lift my mouse once and start painting over it again, it will bring it down. And I think you should be able to reach full opacity after a while. If not, you have to release it, do it again, and finally we can get to full opacity. Again, this is not a real issue, but if you are doing some kind of color critical work where your values need to be exact, just make sure that you are painting with a flow or opacity above 50% to eventually build up to that full opacity. But again, something that's never really going to be a big issue in kind of the real world. All right, let's go ahead and delete this. And let's look at some examples of how you might want to use flow versus opacity. I'm going to grab a gray color here, and I'm going to paint at 100% opacity, flow, and hardness. I'm just going to go ahead and put down like 4 little circles, and we're going to paint these as if we were shading them to become spheres. Let's go ahead and change our color to black, and let's start with opacity. Let's do an opacity of, like we did before, let's do 10% opacity. So 10, alrighty. Now, if I wanted to shade this, like if it was a sphere, with opacity, I can be really precise in my shading because I know that no matter how long I keep this pin pressed down, the value is never going to change. Once I lift the brush, now I can start making certain areas darker. And like before, I have my hardness set to 100% just so it's very easy to see how this is working, but I'll show you that you can still do this with a low hardness and get a more smoother look. But here I have a lot more precise control over what areas I'm affecting because I don't have to worry about the value of my color changing. Once I click that mouse down, it's going to stay at this consistent rate. If I were to go over to white to maybe make like a highlight, I know that I can do something like this. And there you can see that I have very precise control over where I'm shading. Now, of course, like I said, if we were to drop our hardness down to 0%, and let's do that again, you're going to notice I can get a lot smoother and nicer looking shading. Same thing I'm going to do here. So yeah, don't feel that opacity is going to leave you with these kind of very jagged lines. I was just keeping the hardness high so that you can kind of see how it's working. Now, I'm going to show you in a little bit in this video how you can paint so you don't have to worry about going outside the lines, but for now we're painting outside the lines. Okay, so that's opacity, right? I have complete control over that. Now let's look at flow. I'm going to bring my opacity back to 100. Let's bring our flow quite down to like 5%. Let's start off with 100% hardness. We are painting with black. And same thing here. I'm going to, now this time I'm not going to let go of my mouse. I'm just going to continue to paint. And you can see flow comes out pretty fast, like actually way too fast. Let's actually lower this down to like 2%. And here I have a bit more kind of organic control because I'm not releasing the mouse. I'm just doing it all in one stroke. Now, like before, I'm going to get a much nicer transition if I have my hardness down to 0%. Let's go ahead and start with white again. And here I'm just going to slowly build up. Again, I'm not lifting my mouse here. I'm just slowly kind of painting over the areas I want to be darker, still keeping the mouse pressed down. And I can slowly build up that darkness. I might lift it up once because like I showed you before, it's never going to reach full opacity with really low flows. So I may have to kind of release my mouse. But there you can see I can kind of get a different look. So depending on what you're trying to do, whether it be painting or retouching, it's your choice whether you want to use opacity or flow. Personally, for my work, I use flow, but I know some people do prefer using opacity because they have a bit more kind of fine control over where they are shading their values. Some people like to have more of that kind of organic, airbrush type feel. So it's really a preference. So use what's just going to be best for you. So one final thing you may notice is that you may be looking at these shadings and think, wow, those don't look very smooth. That's because currently I am working in 8-bit. And if I were to work in 16-bit, I would get much smoother transitions between my values. Let me just show you what that looks like. I'm going to take my eraser here and just erase this top part like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and go back to my brush. Let's paint another gray sphere, full flow, full hardness. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay, and now let's go back to black. And let's change our flow to 0.2 and our hardness down to 0. And now I'm going to go over to Document, Convert Format. And at the very top here where it says Color Format, we're going to change from RGB8 to RGB16. Hit Convert. Now it's not going to change anything that we've done already, but now when I start painting with my low flow black here, you should easily see that there is quite a difference in the kind of tonal range and the values. Let me go ahead and switch over to white. Let me go back to black here. And I think it's pretty safe to say, I'm sure it's pretty easy to see even on YouTube, that this one that we have done in 16-bit has a lot nicer and smoother transitions than the ones that we did in 8-bit, right? And so if you really want to get super smooth gradations, especially if you're doing things like skies or any kind of really intricate shading like this, it is definitely better to work in 16-bit just because you have much more color information and you have more values, and you have a lot more values between your shadows and your highlights. However, working in 16-bit will significantly increase the file size of your document. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the rest of the options here. More, if you click on that, like I showed before, you can bring up the Edit Brush menu. This is another way that you have a bit more control over your brush settings. I'm not going to talk too much about it in this video, but if you take a look at it, most of it is pretty self-explanatory. We talked about spacing already. We have things like flow. Shape is the shape of the brush. You can rotate it. You can do all kinds of different things. But for now, let's just go ahead and keep it how it kind of was. Okay, next. Force pressure. Now, this is only going to be useful if you're using a tablet that is force sensitive, and not like Star Wars, but like it's pressure sensitive. So let's make a brand new layer. Now, if I were to lightly press on my tablet, you're going to see I have a very thin line, but as I press harder and harder, I can make the brush line a bit thicker. So if I want to get really big, I can kind of like paint really lightly, then like get really thick. And this is just because my Wacom tablet is pressure sensitive, so it detects how hard I am pressing down on the pen. But if you're just using the mouse, that's not going to be an option available to you. All right, next let's look at the stabilizer, because this is kind of a very interesting tool. So let's imagine you're trying to draw like or paint a straight line or kind of a curved line, but you don't have a very steady hand. So you might have a little bit of jitter, especially if you're trying to do it with the mouse or your just hand is not very steady. And you can kind of mitigate that by going really fast, and that usually does help. But if you're trying to do something very precise, you might want to have kind of precise outlines. You might notice that it's just really hard for you to kind of keep a steady hand. That's where the stabilizer can help. What the stabilizer does is if I click on stabilizer and we are in rope mode, you'll notice that I have this little rope attached to my brush cursor. And as I pull, the brush gets pulled along. Now, the cool thing is if I have a lot of jitters like this, you're going to notice they don't really show up too much in my stroke. And so this allows me to make really nice, smooth strokes and not have to worry too much about having a lot of like hand jitter. Now, of course, some jitter will come up a little bit. You can kind of mitigate that by maybe increasing the length of the rope. So if you have a really long rope, then some of that jitter doesn't show up as much. But this is kind of a great little fun way to just kind of make more smooth lines in your illustration and designs. The other mode they have is window mode, and you're going to see it looks a little bit different. So right now, if I'm rope mode, if I pull this along and stop, the paint stays at the end of the rope. That allows me to kind of quickly change direction and do kind of a sharp turn like this. If I come over here, I can do another sharp turn. I want to come over here and do something like that. The window mode operates a little bit differently, where you're going to notice that if I paint and then I stop, the paint comes to my cursor. This means that I can also create really sharp turns, but it kind of makes it a little bit more easier to make kind of sweeping designs. Both of these modes, you're going to have to just play with and see which one works best for what you're doing. But you can see here, like if I go back and let's delete this. If I go back and forth in rope mode, it kind of creates this like really sharp design here. If I go back and forth in window mode, it kind of like creates a little bit more of a curve, just because of the way it operates. So depending on what you're doing, one way is going to be better than the other. All right, let's go ahead and delete this and uncheck that and move into another fun one, which is called Symmetry. So this is kind of fun because basically you can kind of create little symmetrical designs, and you can have as many, I think up to 16, maybe you can do more, but if I do 8 here, now I've got 8 little symmetry things, and I can, you know, make just really kind of cool, fun designs just by doing that. You can, if you grab here, you can kind of click and move this around so you can move it to another spot of your canvas. You can also drag here so you can adjust where, let's go ahead and maybe we do another one. You can adjust the angle. And so this is kind of fun because you can do some really kind of cool stuff. The options you have here, let's go ahead and reset. Actually, I don't know how to reset this actually. So yeah, if someone knows how to reset this in the comments, please let me know. This is something I've never actually really used for any of my work. I just kind of play with it for fun sometimes. But mirror works where it basically creates a mirror. This would be kind of cool, I guess, if you want to kind of make like cool, I don't know, symmetrical designs or something. You know, make like an airplane or something like that. Lock basically prevents you from accidentally clicking this thing. I notice that sometimes when I don't have lock on, if I paint and then I move my cursor, I might accidentally move this. By having lock on, you are unable to move that. So that way you can kind of create cool designs without worrying of accidentally moving your symmetry thing. Blend mode. Now, blend mode works very similar to the blend mode options you have here in your layers. I don't want to cover all these because there are so many. And sometimes when you're painting with it, they can react a little bit different. But I might make another video talking about these blend modes here because they do operate very similar. You're just putting your brush in that blend mode. Okay, and the next mode we're going to look at is this wet edges. Now, when we click wet edges, what that does is it's going to build up paint along the edges of your brush stroke. Now, you're only going to be able to notice this if you are painting with a hardness below 100%. Right now we're at 100%, so you don't really see any difference. The color is actually gotten lighter than the actual color I've selected. But if you drop your hardness, say down to 38%, and you paint, you're going to notice the edges of your brush strokes kind of have paint built up along the edge, kind of creating that watercolor effect. If I reduce the hardness all the way down to 0, I'm going to get more of that softer effect. And so this is kind of cool. I guess if you want to probably combine with something like a low flow, you could probably kind of create some kind of interesting watercolor type effects using different kind of colors, and probably great for painting. But for my type of work, it's not something that I ever really use. All right, let's clear this and let's talk about the last option, Protect Alpha. Let's make a brand new layer and let's go back to black over here. Let's make that ball again. Okay, so right now, the only pixel information on this pixel layer is this little gray ball that I just painted. If I turn off this fill layer underneath, you're going to see behind it is just a transparent background. There's nothing on this layer except that. So if we turn Protect Alpha on, it means that we cannot paint on something where there's not already information. So I'm going to go ahead and grab paint. Let's go ahead and just turn this off for now. I'm going to grab a black color. So I can paint on here because it's kind of painting over the transparent parts of this layer. Now, if I turn Protect Alpha on and I paint, I can't do that. It'll only allow me to paint somewhere where there's already pixel information. So this can be really useful if we were to lower our hardness. Let's lower our flow down to pretty low. This would be really useful. Let's go ahead and turn our fill layer back on just so it's white. This would be really useful if you want to actually do, like I was doing before, shading and not have to worry about kind of painting outside the edges, right? So here I can do a really nice shade, and then maybe I can grab white and do something like this. And then if I wanted to now start painting like a shadow, I'm going to turn this protect alphas off. Let's go to black. And then now I can kind of start like doing a kind of shadow. Now, of course, it's painting over the ball and the background all at once. But then here I kind of have like, okay, now I kind of have a little shadow area. And then if I want to go back and just, I don't know, maybe add some color to this thing, let's change to a different color. I'm going to turn protect alpha back on. And then I can maybe do a little bit of like a highlight here. And I don't know, just mess around and do stuff, right? So there, that's protect alpha. It doesn't allow me to paint on any transparent areas. And one last thing before we close out this video is you, of course, have the ability to save your own brushes and kind of create your own custom brushes. That way you can start slowly building up a set of brushes you use very frequently. Easiest way to do that is probably to first create your own custom category. So if you go to your brush menu and you click down here, you can say create new category, and you can name it to whatever you want. Let's just call it my brushes, for example. Hit OK. And now we have this blank category called my brushes. So in here, what you can do is you can right click and you can create a new brush from scratch. You can say create a new round brush, and then you can adjust some of the settings like low flow, low hardness, maybe make it a little bigger. Then what you need to do is come over here and hit right click, and you can say update brush. And now that brush has been updated to its current settings. If you want, you can right click, you can rename it to something that's going to be easy for you to remember. And there you go. You have your first custom brush. If you have a brush that you adjusted from somewhere else, let's go back to our basics. Let's say you took this brush right here and you liked the hardness setting, or you did something like this. You can right click there and you can say copy brush to category, and you could copy that brush to your new category. And when we now go to that category, you'll see that brush has been copied there. If you decide to make changes to the flow or anything else, for example, or if you wanted to, you could right click, open up the edit brush menu and change some of the spacing, or you could change some of the options here. And then once you've made those changes, you're going to need to right click and say update brush for those changes to stay permanent. Then you could go over here and rename it to something that you thought might be easy to recognize. And now you're always going to have access to those brushes, and then you have them from here on out so you can continue to use them in your workflow. All right, guys, so that's going to be all for this video here. I just wanted to cover the basics of the brushes in Affinity Photo. So I hope that you found this video helpful. And if you are new to Affinity Photo, I have a lot of videos geared toward beginners, covering things like layers and masks, making selections, clone brushes, etc. So please do go check those out. And until then, I guess I will see you guys in the next video. All right, guys, later.